Thank you so much, Meher. I think that quote was a wonderful way to kind of end that bit before the panel. Please allow me to now introduce our other guests for the panel. I may start with Lindsay. Lindsay is CEO at the Cambridge India Sustainability. Sorry, I'm saying so much of Cambridge India today, I feel like it's stuck with me. Excuse me, Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. Mahua Acharya, founder and CEO of International Energy Transition Platform. And of course, our moderator, Ketan Deshpande, founder and CEO of Fuel. Folks, over to you. I'll just get you mic'd up, yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion. I am in minority today, but we have wonderful three panelists, and you've just heard Meher talking about her company. So we have interesting questions, and we look forward for your questions also at the end of the panel. And first of all, let me start introducing the panel. Meher, Chairperson Thermax, as you saw her case study already, so I don't think we need further introduction. Sure. But Mahua, from my left, Climate Finance and Energy Transition Leader, and Lindsay, Executive Director of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. So thank you very much for making time for this panel. And our first question is, how can climate innovation fuel economic growth without compromising equity, which is a very important question. Maybe who wants to take the first one? Yeah, you want to start with that?
How can
climate innovation fuel economic growth without compromising equity?
Yeah, I think a lot of it I spoke about in my own presentation. I think there's a lot that we can do as a company, and I think in terms of a company also has a responsibility, as I mentioned, to all its stakeholders. And Thermax has grown into a green energy company by being very inclusive of all its stakeholders. And I think it comes from the culture of an organization, the values of an organization. And maybe this is a point where I'll talk a little bit about SOCO, which is the social compact. I don't know whether any of you saw the television when COVID happened and struck India. A number of, suddenly one day, all transportation came to an end and stopped, overnight. There were a number of migrant workers, many of whom work in our organizations, and they had to find their way home, walking several hundreds and thousands of miles. And it was a horrible sight to see because many people lost their lives, and it was just very horrible. And so a few of us got together and said that, how do we do something about these people, many of whom could be part of your ecosystem. Now, whether it's a green ecosystem or not doesn't matter, but they're part of the ecosystem. And so we all came together and we worked with an NGO called Dasra, and we called it the Social Compact. And we became accountable for 6 outcomes. And today, so just a few of them one is on safety. So whether it is a permanent employee, a temporary employee, or a migrant worker, everybody will be treated the same as far as safety is concerned. We were doing it anyway in our company, but everybody who joins the social compact will sign up to that. Can we move more and more towards living wages rather than minimum wages? Minimum wages in India, in a place like Pune, is 12,000 rupees a month. I don't know how much is that in pounds, but it is 100 pounds a month. I mean, how can anybody live in 100 pounds a month with a family of 4 or 5 people? So like that, we signed up to 6 outcomes. And today we are about 65 companies that have signed up to the social compact, and we are all working towards it. So I think inclusive growth is something that we're looking at, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that experience. I think quite resonates. From Meher, I want to go to Mahua, and you speak about designing inclusive energy and infra projects for underserved population. There's a resonation there. Your experience in that.
Sure, thank you. Firstly, thank you for having me at this event. Let me try and answer your question on the equity piece and the inclusivity. I'll use an example and I'll use a case study. And since we're in an academic setting, I'll try and focus a little bit on some of the business model numbers thing. I was in the government, I worked for the government, and when you're in the government of any country actually, but even more so in a developing country like India, your first and foremost requirement is you're there to serve the masses. And so whatever you make has to be affordable. Whatever you do has to be affordable. Any policy design that you do and you develop has to reach scale. So that's the first and foremost prerogative that you feel in the system, because when you sit inside and on those seats, you have the whole country in front of you. So to your first question, how does one make climate finance and without affecting equity? And then your other question on affordability. So I'll pick up an example, and it's a fairly large example which you can see the next time some of you are in India, for those of you that are not from the country. I worked on electric mobility. I was in the government. I built out a government company that we made it dedicated to electric mobility. And the most disruptive, we worked on 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers, cars, charging stations. There was a time that pretty much all the charging stations were done by us. And then the most disruptive and biggest became electric buses for public transport. So that's like your TfL transport for London buses that roam around in the city. So these are buses that the government owned otherwise. To your equity question, transport fares are subsidized. They're subsidized all over the world, by the way. They're not just special in India. And it's hard to raise transport fares because of just our demographics. And anywhere actually in the world. I lived in Seoul before this. I was in Washington. I was in London. I was in Geneva. Everywhere, public transport is a subsidized business. So like the same thing out here. Now we want to change this to electric. These were running on diesel. Diesel prices are only going one way. They only go up, by the way. I haven't seen them stay flat. And it's a big import bill. Plus also it's quite polluting. So all of those sort of things that you want to get rid of, the technology at hand that we had was batteries. But you know, just take a guess. Will anybody here take a guess? What is the price difference between a diesel bus and an electric bus? Random, just take a guess. What is the multiple? 3 times. It's 3 times. It's 3 times the cost. One electric bus, it costs 3 times that of diesel. And remember, fares are subsidized. For diesel itself, they were subsidized. And now you can imagine the whammy you're going to get when you're trying to put for public transport without raising fares. How do I put an electric bus on the road? So we ended up changing the business model. Whereas the government would own the bus, own the driver, the battery, the car, everything with it, now the government buys a service. And that service is spread over 12 years. So then I bring that initial capex down, since I'm talking to a business school audience here, I bring the initial capex down and amortize it over 12 years. And amortize it in such a way that the technology people are told that your battery better last, the body better last, I need it spec'd it a certain way, and it must match what capital will fit over 12 years. If it's private equity, they want to leave in about 4 years, they want 25% returns. Now remember, fares are subsidized. It is politically very difficult to raise fares, even if they have to catch up with inflation and so on. I don't mean just increasing them to cover costs. So we designed a business model, and we found that the prices that we got for that service is cheaper than diesel by 30%.
Oh.
We didn't need a subsidy anymore. We went from 330 buses on the road that were running, electric buses, to 5,500 in the first tender, 6,500 in the second tender, and at 17,500, the bus companies told me, if you're going to run another tender, we will need more than 24 hours in the day to run shifts. And nobody had thought that our supply chain could manage it. So a lot of our companies, first and foremost, what you do, you grab this and then you say, oh, I don't know where I'm going to buy the batteries from. But just speaking of equity, people want those electrics now. We were able to spec them because we had scale. So then you have the command over policy. 25% of the seats of the drivers are reserved for women. So the requirement is that 25% of these buses, which are now run by a private company, they are operated by a private company, and the government buys a service. And that service, by the way, is cheaper than diesel, so the government's quite happy. They don't have to spend the upfront money. And to your point about equity, it is now, there's no change in fares. Right. It's a more comfortable ride. It's air conditioned. These are hydraulic brakes, so it's quiet and it's not uncomfortable. And people wait. The next time any of you are in India, in pretty much all cities, we did this in 16 cities across the country, people are waiting for the electric to come. When you can see over there that bus number 202 is coming in 4 minutes, what it doesn't do is, unfortunately, it doesn't tell you that 202 is an electric and 203 is a diesel, because people are waiting for the electric to come. So it is entirely possible to achieve scale. It's entirely possible to achieve affordability. And India is a rapidly developing country. So much of India is yet to be built. I traveled around 3-4 countries in the little time I had to learn. I came to London to learn the TfL model. We went to Chile, we went to Brazil, and then came back and said, we've got no choice but to just design it for ourselves. So whatever we could grab from other places, it is entirely possible to achieve both. It is now perhaps one of the biggest climate finance infrastructure assets being looked at.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think that piece of 25% of women was an excellent example for taking the equity further. So, Lindsay, I think you add a lot of global perspective. Cambridge Institute of Sustainability is something which world looks at. So how do you bring this perspective on frameworks, especially balancing justice with innovation?
Sure. It's a real pleasure to be here. For those that don't know us, we're an institute within the university. We've been working for 30 years, predominantly with multinational businesses, financial institutions, and with the public sector. And our focus is on accelerating market-wide change. We spend quite a lot of time working, and we still do, at individual business level, but we recognize that the cumulative impact of even the most innovative companies, like the case study we've just heard, which was incredibly inspiring, it's not scaling fast enough. We're not seeing enough of the phase out of challenging business models, and we're not yet seeing the transition and the scaling of what's needed. So we're very focused on how do we accelerate market-wide, economy-wide transition, and we do that through working with the private sector. But we also know we won't see that acceleration if we don't engage with issues of social justice. We simply won't get social permission, social buy-in, the support we need for some really tough choices ahead. So we increasingly are going to have to foreground and engage with these issues. I am not an expert in any way on India, and just hearing the examples, I think Europe has a lot to learn. I think the scale and the complexity and the innovation that's happening, I think this is not a kind of East learning from the West. I think there is a lot that we can learn, which is why I was really pleased to be here today. A lot of the businesses we work with are recognizing they're going to have to grapple with these issues of inclusive growth. But I think for too long have looked at it from a kind of a a social responsibility on the side, like we'll make our money here and then we'll put something back over here, or looked at hero projects, or looked in quite a micro way at specific aspects of their work. And we challenge them to think strategically, to think about what's your net impact, the fact you exist, what impact does that have on society, whose needs do you meet, who do you employ, you're moving capital around the economy through what you pay, the tax you pay, the infrastructure that you build, your political and cultural influence. So to look at that in a rounded sense. But we also recognize that, I suppose, fairness, justice, it's not like measuring carbon. It's quite subjective in many ways. In parts of the world, it is very much an individualistic kind of individual freedoms and individual choices. And in other parts of the world, it's very much a kind of collective well-being. So it's really hard to get an objective, definitive approach. Our approach is to take a principles-based lens on this, to look at, okay, well, are you making sure your decisions are giving a fair distribution of costs and benefits? So it's great to hear this example that you just shared around improved livelihoods for farmers. So it's not just the business that's benefiting, that there's a good distribution of the benefits there. In Europe, there are just transition funds to support those communities left behind, financial support for the capital costs. You were talking about buses, but those happen at a domestic level. So support there. Access to opportunity, obviously green skills, but also opportunities to invest in projects where communities can actually benefit from investing in say, renewable projects that are going up. Then there's much more support locally. Participation in decision-making processes, increasingly important, particularly when there are going to be tough choices, people feeling that they've had a stake in decisions. Recognition of rights, whether it's land rights or human rights, but also recognition of local practices, local knowledge is really important. And then making sure that we're not only looking at the here and now, so fairness, justice over geographies, we're not sending all our negative impacts somewhere else, but we're all good, and over time, really needing to take a long-term perspective for future generations. So when we're working with the private sector, those are the kind of principles and frameworks that we're working with.
Thank you. I think that was interesting. I think the first part covered a lot of questions which we wanted to do. But I think the next part is how a policy, capital and technology evolving to enable sustainable development, especially in India. And this time I can start from you. The question is how a policy, capital and technology, these three parts, you touched upon it, but a little bit detail on this.
I'll give you another, this is an emerging topic. It will take a few years to build out. But let me continue on the mobility thing. And let me link it up right now with policy and technology. I think Mr. Nirmal Jain before us early in the morning was talking about how we make payments in India from peer-to-peer. And that business has been revolutionized. So now let's take your charging, let's take your electric car, and you've plugged it in, you've charged up, you don't need it at night, you've gone to bed, it has some extra charge. You could sell that charge back to the grid. You could decide, if somebody told you that if I charge my car at 5 p.m., I pay the least. If I charge at 5:30, maybe it'll be 0. So I plan my travel to come back. Right now, we don't have that system in the country. We don't have the system because the government does not allow us to do peer-to-peer trading. We use distribution companies. Distribution companies are large monolithic organizations that pretty much own the neural networks and they own the physical networks. So now I need to optimize for this big chunk of electric vehicles that are coming along. There were lots of studies when we were working on this and people told me, oh, we're going to need 3-4 gigawatts of energy. Just Delhi alone and just for buses needs 400 extra megawatts just to power those buses. Now just imagine what all I could do with 400 megawatts. Right now our thinking is linear. If it's 400 megawatts, I need to buy that 400 megawatt from somewhere. Our grid in India, in a lot of countries by the way, is not a two-way discussion between the consumer and me. I could find that 400 megawatts if somebody decided to switch off their lights if they were not using it. So that 400 might come down to 380. It might come down to 350. Who knows? But maybe Delhi government will have to buy less power. So where technology comes in is just in exactly the same way that we have been transmitting money between two people, we should now be able to trade electrons between two people. The biggest barrier to that kind of trade outside of policy issues, right now policy doesn't allow me to trade peer-to-peer. I can't sell my extra energy to you even though you're my neighbor and I know you're having a party next door and you will probably need the lights on for longer. I can't sell it right now. But let's say that is the policy unlock which will come. But where does technology come in? I can't interact with my grid right now. My grid is, their machinery is with them, their documentation is with them, their information is with them, and quite physically it is in the corporate office, it's in the regional office, it's in my local office. So if I have to have a discussion, where do I put my car? I probably have to wait a few weeks before I get that answer, because I have to wait to see where there's a transformer capacity and it has enough load and things like that. So when the grid gets digitized and there is a new small little development to create a digital grid by making a digital twin of that grid, and once that's available, then that data is available to me. Now add the policy unlock and I should be able to eventually grow into a society where I can trade my electrons person to person.
Excellent. I think that's a good idea. Hope you're
it's happening. It's a very large initiative. It's going to take a lot of time because it has to go through layers and layers and layers of policy analysis. It has to go through layers of the development of these neural networks. How do I trade? Some company will come and sit on top of this neural network. But the discussion, the work that's going on now is the writing of code for this neural network. That technology layer is being developed today as we speak.
Excellent. So thank you for sharing this. And moving on to Meher. Meher, you shared a lot on ESG piece also, and Thermax has a great reputation of implementing ESG regulations. So your perspective on how industrial firms can adopt ESG regulations and financial incentives for those. Maybe a role model for somebody.
Yeah, I actually, when I think of ESG, it actually makes my blood boil, because everybody only talks about the E of ESG. We tend to talk about the S, and Lindsay talked a little bit about it and how we need to embrace it as part of business, the S, and it's not just CSR, which is 2%. What about the 98%? Yeah, so I also feel, and governance, of course, there's some talk about it, but that also can sort of be left aside. So it's really everybody means E when we talk of ESG. Which is very sad, because I think, and in some ways, it's also a moral dilemma that we are going through as a country. Because, when you talk of, there are three, I feel that there are three components. It's people, it's planet, and in a way, it's energy security. Okay, so I'm going to sort of link the three. And India is, as you all know, is still a developing country. It is a poor country. A lot of people have aspirations to get more of an income, and with 400 megawatts of energy just to power electric buses, and that too in 17 cities yet, we'll need much, much more power. So on the one hand, we're looking at huge amounts of power to be created. Dr. Lal spoke about of fusion, which probably will take at least another 10 or 15 years. So what does India do? Can India really live on just solar and wind? No. We need a base load. And we also today, every country is talking about energy security. And India is also talking about energy security. And so we will have to put in a lot more thermal power till such time as we get maybe 10 years down the road. And then probably as other technologies come in, batteries are more reliable, maybe then we can look at something different. On the ESG front, I also feel when we talk about coal, today almost 2 million people are actually employed between the railways and the coal sector. And why do I talk about railways? Because 50% of freight carried by our Indian railways is coal. So they're very dependent on coal. And therefore, the whole thing is very, very interrelated. And therefore, people's livelihoods are involved. Which is why I think we need to really look at the three for some time, at least, till technology comes in, new technologies come in, where we can look at it a little different. And with regard to the S, as I mentioned, it bothers me because I feel that businesses should be looking at the S within the business itself. And how do we look at the way we recruit people? In India, I'll be very open over here. Are we recruiting enough Muslims, for example, in companies? Do we have, how much of our prejudice comes in when we have an interview with somebody with a minority? Yeah, so I think things like that is all about the S of ESG. It's all about inclusion, it's all about equity. And these things are very different in a country like India. And that's something that I feel that each business really needs to focus on. Because otherwise we're going to leave a very large portion of our society out, and I don't think that's really inclusive, sustainable growth.
Well, thank you for sharing, and I think your point of 98% is very valid in that case.
Yep.
Inclusivity is important, and she mentioned about railways, and which is an institution itself in India. So, and Lindsay, at your end, institutions and academia and investors, all of them, how can they achieve long-term sustainability? What do you think are some of the evolving methods that can support long-term sustainability?
So I think at the moment we've got a lot of smart, innovative work, but happening in quite siloed ways. We have misaligned incentives, and we aren't always doing things in the right order. So in some places, I suppose putting a huge volume of new renewables onto grids where the grids aren't yet prepared for that can be challenging. So doing the right things in the right order with aligned incentives to be able to scale it is really what's needed, and ultimately really effective public-private collaboration there. We look at academia, a really valuable role to play, has played and continues to play an important role in understanding the nature and scale of the challenge and innovating in the solutions. But we have a lot, we know really what the problems are. We have a lot of the tech solutions already. The challenges are predominantly economic, political, cultural. So we need much more insight, evidence there. But we also need to be more effective in getting the evidence and insight into decision making. And the real challenges there, we can see what's happening in the US with the administration's response to universities. In the UK, Dan Coyle in the Bennett Institute recently wrote in the FT about how the UK government is actually not particularly interested in evidence from universities at the moment. So how do we ensure that decision making is informed by great thinking within academia? Capital, music to my ears to hear your challenge of ESG. We've seen certainly in Europe and the US an ESG hype bubble where which has now burst. The ESG party's over, as the FT said, which was very much all about just wherever the wind wins, and a lot of false promises and lack of rigor within that. And where there are places where the economics already works, where it's already favourable, but there are places where it doesn't, because externality is not being priced in, short-termism in trying to tackle long-term challenges, or where we've got subsidies that are still, you talked about subsidies propping up damaging industries. So we need better rules of the game so that it really incentivises and gives a commercial pathway so that capital is directed where it's needed. That needs state action, but it won't happen without the private sector calling for it and being at the table to say what will drive real world outcomes, because just more disclosure won't deliver more action. And there's been an over-reliance on disclosures rather than actual incentives for capital to move. So really important piece there. On institutions, and I'm taking this to mean really public sector institutions predominantly, as we just heard, a need for joined up incentives, infrastructure is a really critical unlock that's needed. The skills, procurement, you talked about how that's a pull through, the procurement that creates the business model. And sometimes it's just the permitting, just getting approvals through quickly enough so that there isn't that, I suppose, the timescale risk. In our work in the UK and Europe, we're saying to governments, look, it's great that you've got climate targets, but what you need is a real strategy. You need an industrial strategy, which is really clear about how you're driving and incentivizing transition, how you're scaling innovation, how you're phasing out what's damaging. You need an economic deal alongside that. How are you going to use finite public funds to catalyze private markets? Where's the very best use of that public finance? And how do you not just regulate markets, but shape and build markets for the future? And really importantly, a social deal that includes the skills, it includes participation in processes. But none of this will really happen unless the private sector recognizes you can't do business, as in your quote, I think your mother, the kind of in a planet, in a society that's not working or on a dead planet. So a really important role for the business sector in its own interest to say, look, we need this. We need really effective transition planning and delivery and the incentives to enable us to be there and contribute.
Well, thank you so much. I think all of you also gave examples of how the implementation is done during your conversation. So I think moving from theory to practice, I think one important question which I want to ask all of you, and that's, what does the future of climate leadership look like? And particularly from India to the global stage. And Meher, I want to start with you particularly on corporate moral leadership and governance in India. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think industry can do this. I mean, one is if you're mandated, but the other is if there's genuinely a purpose behind it. And I think this whole purpose-led leadership, to my mind, is far more sustainable. But at the end of the day, it's commerce and it's business and it's a P&L. And so getting the right technologies that are cost effective, that serve the market, is what is really important. And I think this whole purpose, values, in some ways decides what you take and what you don't. For example, I'll just give a small example in our own company. About 15 years ago, just like Mahua spoke about the financial model that had to be changed for electric buses, we decided that for some part of the business with some customers, instead of selling a boiler, can we sell steam as a service? And as you know, boilers run on fuel. And we decided, we brought it to the board actually and said that should we do it on any boiler or should we only do it on green? And make that whole business a green business. And I remember 15 years ago, there was a lot of uproar in the board because many people said, are you stupid? You lose a lot of revenue, you lose a lot of profit if you just focus on green boilers. And I remember a few of us put our foot down and said, doesn't matter. Even if we lose top line, even if we lose bottom line for a while, it's okay. And we stuck to our ground. And today that business is doing, we lost a lot in the beginning, but over time that business is doing very well. Now, I can also say this when you are doing okay. You know, when you're not doing well, it's not such an easy decision. Yeah, so it also depends on which part of the business one is in terms of the time horizon. And so it's easier said than done. But yeah, but I think it's either, as I said, purpose-led, so internally led, or externally mandated, like it is for many of our customers are externally mandated by their customers who are in the West. Yeah, but some of them are purpose-led as well, and they want to move. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I think this example would give a lot of thought processes for those who are looking at taking those tough decisions. I think, thank you for sharing that. Moving on to Mahua, in terms of global perspective and global climate platforms, do you think India is ready to take that leadership for sustainability?
I'm often asked this question, what is political risk in the context of climate change and sustainability and green things? I'm often asked, what does political risk look like in India? And nowadays I have to just look at them wide-eyed and say, what are you talking about? Have you been to Washington recently? One, what kind of political risk question seriously is that? I cannot imagine in a developing country, in a big developing country like India, any political party gets a seat if they do not talk about economic growth. So I cannot imagine that if the electric vehicle movement or the green movement or blending movement or renewables, solar, whatever it is, if it is not part of somebody's economic agenda, there's no way that party is going to be voted into power. So that's one. So political risk, when people ask me about political risk with great levels of concern, when it comes to green, I haven't figured out how to articulate an answer to that question. And no, this is not just Washington. It's a lot of Europe as well. In fact, it's a lot of the UK. I've been at the receiving end of a very large investment that went away because that money was now to be used for replenishing the loss from Ukraine. This is green money. It's not foreign assistance. It's not foreign aid. India doesn't barely qualifies for foreign aid nowadays. So it comes now, political risk when it comes to climate is an international matter. It's now, as far as India is concerned, it's really something that India has now increasingly taken the decision, increasingly vocal about it, that this climate business affects us. It affects us right across the board. We're a developing country, we're an agrarian economy, we rely hugely on agriculture. We're very, very susceptible to drought, water patterns, rainfall patterns, cyclones, all of the above. That's not climate change. We buy a hell of a lot of oil, huge amount of oil. There's geopolitics involved there. So it's in completely national interest to reduce that bill, especially in today's geopolitical situation. So what does climate look like, or climate leadership look like from India? It's a national story. It's a national story based on economic growth. So when people ask me, your bus project, and now I'm working on trucks, and your electric mobility project, great on climate. It is great on climate, of course it is. It's greater on diesel bills, because I reduce that expenditure and naturally reduce the dependency on one particular nation. And so that, of course, is of national importance. So climate leadership certainly is India there. I think India is there in so many areas, so many very large areas. Much of it is also to do with energy security. Today's discussions on supply chain are to do with raw material. That mineral and those raw materials are used for what? They're used for hydrogen, they're used for electric mobility, they're used for electrification. We're doing higher technology stuff for long-term bets. So it's a very national agenda. And if it works for India, then just the sheer size of it will work for the world.
Wow, that's a good point. So Lindsay, your final words on this India becoming a global stage for sustainability. Do you agree with that?
Yes. No, I do. I think a lot of the old ideas are not working, and a lot of, I suppose, Western thinking and Washington consensus is kind of broken, and we need new ideas and new thinking, and we need solutions that work at scale, at pace, in very complex contexts. And I think that we are increasingly, in fact, so Jaideep's joined our board as an institute. We are increasingly, and we work with Persis as an ambassador, because we recognize India's growing leadership leadership, influence, and the innovation that's happening there. I think, and leadership, I think, looks like delivering on national priorities, finding ways to deliver on and address climate nature challenges that deliver growth and competitiveness and social development and security, unlocking private capital, finding the ways to shape the markets to do that. I think importantly, it is going to get increasingly challenging. We will see more geopolitical tensions around this, so strengthening the foundations, the science, the innovation ecosystems, making sure the transparent media and the ability to hold people accountable because we have transparency, the rule of law, social cohesion, and importantly international collaborations. And I think India's been really influential there in international alliances. But I think some of the, as a democracy, the ability to move quickly as a democracy and the lessons that can be learned by others from that, the fact that, as you were talking about, there are solutions that work rurally as well, where there's a lot of focus on urban contexts. I think that's a real opportunity for leadership there as well. And the fact that there's just, I suppose, a lot of optimism around the potential of what can be achieved, where other economies are somewhat talking a lot about declinism. So I think there's a real potential here to lead a pathway to the future.
Thank you. So one liner, if I have to say, of this panel is, India can and should lead the world through innovation, inclusion, and intentionality. So these are the 3 points to summarize. But if you're good on time, can we take a couple of questions? Yeah. So if there are any questions to our panel, yes.
Yeah. So, firstly, thank you so much for a very rich panel. And I guess my question is to both Mahua and Meher. So, firstly, let's just establish that climate risk can also be credit risk, given that we face so much of flooding, so much of natural disasters. So the question is as follows: how receptive do you think?
Thank you.
Should I repeat the question?
No.
Okay.
Yes.
So how receptive do you think are businesses to differential interest rates from banks?
Yeah.
Because if it is a credit risk, then greener companies perhaps like Thermax should get rebate, and browner companies like coal producers should be charged a penalty. Now this has been implemented in some regions, it's been experimented with Deutsche Bundesbank and so on. The question is, from a business owner's perspective, do you think businesses are receptive to this idea that banks are going to levy a penalty to us if we're not fast enough in the transition?
So this is a question on financial markets and the financial system. More of a financial system than, of course, a company. Any company would, of course, Meher would like cheaper money for all the good stuff she's doing. She's probably not getting cheaper money. It's the same rate the bank's giving her. So it's a financial systems question. Let me backtrack. There is work going on in India, but let me backtrack to where it came from. In 2015, the State Bank of India conducted an assessment of climate risk across its portfolio. And it came to the State Bank of India and the National Bank for Rural Development, NABARD. This is the bank that funds agriculture. Said, I'm going to take a look at my portfolio to see what it looks like, what my loans and the loan health looks like with regard to the geography. They came to an internal conclusion. There was enough data being mapped that in certain areas, agriculture productivity is coming down, so my yield is becoming less, and therefore my repayment is at risk. Pure, simple lending math. The same thing happened in State Bank of India, and both banks came to the conclusion that we have now mapped out climate risk, but we've got a very large risky portfolio on our hands. So what do we do about it? These are regulated institutions. So went to then the equities regulator, SEBI. And the first step, after a few months, I think it took about a year of discussion, the Reserve Bank, the central bank, was brought into the discussion. The Reserve Bank of India has about 100 PhDs working on climate risk, by the way. They're working on all kinds of things, including climate risk. These PhDs are now having to do some modeling. They've been working with the insurance companies, and step 0 is to produce a taxonomy to begin with. What exactly is climate risk to begin with? So there is now a taxonomy, there is now a description for climate risk, There is a taxonomy for a draft taxonomy for what constitutes green in the first place. Next steps will be how to align itself to financial markets because of intercountry borrowing and interstate borrowing, intercountry borrowing. So it's a very difficult question to answer. Meaning, I don't mean transactionally between you and me, but it's a difficult system to answer because our financial markets do not follow climate movements. We want to move towards a lower carbon, more resilient, greener economy. Our financial markets don't respond to that right now, and this is not an India problem, it's all over the world.
Yeah, if I can just add that, 15 years ago, of course, when we wanted to start this organization, and people said, why don't you look for green finance? We actually went around trying to look for green reduced rate finance, nothing available. I mean, people wouldn't even drop by 0.5%. So it was exactly the same whether you're brown or green, doesn't matter. But that's where, in some ways, policies come in, government policies come in. And India, in fact, is starting something. It used to be called PAT, which was the Perform, Achieve, and Trade. Today, they're going for carbon credits. It's a carbon credit exchange system. So 9 sectors have been identified that are hugely carbon emitting, and like steel, aluminum, refineries, all those. And we're going to actually have now a mandate in terms of you have to reduce your carbon emissions by so much each year. And if you don't, there's the credit system. So it's just coming into being, in fact, as we speak.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for this panel. Supremely interesting. I just wanted to... I wanted to ask, you all come from a sustainability background and with some obviously spectacular understanding of how it integrates with wider economies. But my background is supply chain data science, logistics, venture capital. There's always more to something than just the emissions of a singular factory or a single vehicle. I feel the issue that sustainability doesn't loop together with the financial economy is because in many instances it can be perceived as more difficult to do something more sustainable at its local scale, when really it should be communicated that something is more resource efficient and therefore cheaper, and therefore a better solution over its full supply chain. So I'd like to get your insights into this sort of perspective, what sort of things you guys are doing, what you would suggest what India is doing, to understand this full holistic supply chain of the sustainable world and how it could be possibly implemented and used to get to the point of clinking those two things together, please.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So a lot of what we're trying to do and the businesses that we're working with is, firstly, we need to reframe this. This isn't about saving the planet. That will save itself. We might individually care about species loss, but that's not from a business. When you're working in markets that don't care about your values and caring about value, that can't be an effective framing. So reframing and talking about, well, what's the value? Is it enhanced resilience? Is it cheaper? Is it more efficient? So reframing how we talk about it. And there certainly are places right now where it just makes sense. The economics are already there. Sometimes it requires having to work differently, but there's not a cost penalty. But there are places where there are, or particularly, for instance, where it's more kind of a consumer market, where they may not perceive a more sustainable choice as providing superior benefits and may see it as a compromise. And that's where we will need regulation, and we will need enough political census to get the politicians that are able to tell the truth about some things. So we can certainly, where it's more efficient, smarter, more secure, absolutely we should be focusing on that, not about it's green, it's save the planet, it's moral responsibility. But we also have to be honest that that in itself will not deliver everything that we need. We will need to do incentivize things that aren't anyway the smarter, cleaner thing. I think ultimately, if we didn't have the pressure of time, the combination of tech innovation and market forces would ultimately, superior products would but we don't have the luxury of time. We're having to accelerate it where the economics aren't always there. It isn't always the cheaper, more efficient solution in every case. Or the capital costs are just, it's a time frame issue. The economics just don't play out in a way that's commercially viable in a time frame that makes sense for whoever's sitting with the cost of the investment.
So thank you. Just like you said, luxury of time is not available there. We also don't have. Thank you for this lovely panel. Please give them a round of applause. And the last line is, let's let India's green transition be not just a headline, but a legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was an extremely thought-provoking session. You've given the room a lot to think about. May I please invite Professor Prabhu to give mementos to our guests.
There's photos being taken from the top as well.
Thank you so much, Professor. Before we shift gears for the evening, as you'll see on the agenda, the next bit is going to be conversations around tech and governance, things that we all love. We'll take a quick 15-minute break so everyone can get a breather before we invite our next guest on. We will begin sharp at 3:15, so that's about a 12-minute break, sorry.